This week we're going to start the ACI concrete test field procedures, and we're going to look at three this week. The first is procedures for sampling to form your composite representative concrete sample on which your tests are performed. We're going to look at how to measure the temperature of concrete, and then also how to measure the slump of concrete. And I'm going to let some other online videos describe the procedures in a little more detail, but I just wanted to kind of highlight some of the key bullet points um, in those procedures that will show up in the written questions. So the first is sampling, and you'll see this timeline kind of addressed. There's kind of two timelines at work here, and when a concrete delivery shows up on site, um, once you begin collecting your portion, you have 15 minutes from when you begin collecting to when you're done collecting your sample. And at that 15-minute mark, you haul over whatever it is, your 5-gallon buckets if that's what you're using, or your wheelbarrow, and you get to your testing station or your testing site on a job site. And as soon as you get there, you remix your concrete with a shovel. Um, and then at that um, point in time, a new clock begins, and we can call that 0 minutes. And as soon as you've remixed and formed your concrete composite sample, within the first 5 minutes, you have to measure the temperature, measure the slump, and begin the air content tests. Within 15 minutes, you have to begin casting your cylinders, and that's typically the last thing you do. So things are moving pretty fast, um, but once you get into a routine, it kind of goes bang, bang, bang. So within that first 15 minutes here, when you're collecting your sample can come from a couple different delivery systems. 99% of the time, we're dealing with what you see here in this first picture. That's that rotary drum mix truck delivery. And when that is the case, also a stationary mixer that might be on site already. If that's how you're obtaining, or if that's the means of delivery, you would obtain your concrete sample from um, two regularly spaced portions of that batch. So the portion of your batch has to occur after the first 10% has been discharged and before the last 10% has been discharged from that truck. So it's that middle 80% of the batch that you're going to collect your sample from, and you want to collect your sample in two individual regularly spaced portions. So generally what people do is they'll have the contractor divert that chute, right, this chute here, away from the mold or the forms, and allow you to put your wheelbarrow under it. And you collect half your portion, you pull your wheelbarrow out, you wait a second or two, and you go right back in with your wheelbarrow. Typically, the regs say you should do that, regularly spaced within 15 minutes, but you're going to drive a contractor nuts if you wait around 5 and 7 minutes for your second portion. So you go in with your barrel, out, go right back in and out. The volume that you need to collect is a minimum of a half of a cubic foot unless you're also making cylinders. If you're making test cylinders, like you can see down here in this first picture, you need a minimum of 1 cubic foot. And that's typically always the case. You're generally always going to make test cylinders to test strength. So keep that number in mind. Minimum of a 1 cubic foot sample is what, and that's basically almost a full wheelbarrow. So once you've got your wheelbarrow, you want to transport over to your testing area. And while you're transporting it, you want to protect it from a few things. You want to protect it from sun, from wind, from evaporation, and from contamination. And those are some key words that show up in the written test questions. Once you get, again, to your test site, you want to remix your two samples into one, so you have a nice homogeneous composite sample that's representative of the entire delivery system. The only difference here is in this bottom right picture. This is kind of a paver, or a concrete paving delivery that's placed directly on the ground. And if that's how your concrete is being discharged on the project site, you need to go sample this thing in 5 different locations, not just 2, like you would get from a rotary drum. That's not typical. I don't even know that Montana is really using concrete for any highways anymore. It got such a bad reputation in the 80s and 90s. There was a really bad stretch of concrete interstate near Big Timber, and also the stretch between Bozeman and Belgrade back in the mid-90s was so terrible. Asphalt's all you see. So I don't think you're really going to see this case, but you have to know it for the test. The other thing to mention, if we look back at this first picture, is when that concrete is being pumped, right? So here's the traditional drum, and you'd usually have just a chute coming out where it would discharge it right into your forms. If you've got to pump that concrete quite a ways away, that's where you have to be with your wheelbarrow. So there's no way you can get a wheelbarrow out on like a slab here if it's full of reinforcing rebar and stuff. So you just have to coordinate with the driver, with the contractor, to get them to swing that boom back over to the edge here so you can get your composite sample. One of the questions addressed in the reading materials is if extra water or admixtures are being added into the truck here, when do you get your sample? Before the admixtures or after? And you have to get your sample after everything has been added, right? It doesn't make any good to do your tests on concrete out here if after you've collected your sample, they've added some other ingredients that are going to change the properties of that concrete. So keep that in mind when you answer the questions for homework this week, and also on the certification test. Oh, one last thing to mention with sampling is this is the ASTM number for the test, C172. Every one of these tests has a different number. They will ask you the question, what is the test number for sampling freshly mixed concrete? So remember this number, CS172. When you look at these other tests, temperatures, you're not going to ever be asked any of the questions on what is the test number for any of the other tests, but you will have to know CS172. I guarantee that'll be on the test. So temperature. There's a really good video. It's less than a minute long. I'm going to have you watch on temperature, but the key points to remember, these are the stumbling blocks that people are going to miss when they're performing the temperature test or when they're answering questions on the temperature test. You have to calibrate your thermometer annually or whenever the accuracy is questionable. You can measure the concrete temperature directly in the wheelbarrow or in a wall form, so it doesn't have to be a separate portion of your mix reserved specifically for temperature, right? You're measuring temperature in any portion of your sample that you've collected. You have to have a minimum of 3 inches of concrete surrounding the thermometer on all sides. You have to leave the thermometer in the concrete for a minimum of 2 minutes or until your temperature stabilizes, but no more than 5 minutes. Because remember, you're doing temperature within that first 5-minute window once you've collected your composite sample. Once you've inserted the thermometer into the concrete, you want to make sure, remember, to tamp the neck of the thermometer so you can seal it from any ambient air getting down in there. That's a step a lot of people forget if they're going to forget something. And you want to read the temperature on the thermometer while it's still in the concrete. Don't pull it out and read it. that'll cause you to fail the test. You want to read it to the nearest 1 degree Fahrenheit. And one of the test questions actually is, after reading the thermometer, what do you do? And the answer is you record it, right? And then slump. There's another good video for you to watch on slump. It's just a couple minutes long. But the key points here is that your slump mold has to be clean and moistened or dampened before you begin your test. So you always have a 5-gallon bucket of water when you're doing these tests. You're basically just dipping all your tools into that water to make sure everything's moist before you use these tools. It has to be performed on a non-absorbent base. If you're using one of these little plates, that's non-absorbent. Most people just have a piece of plywood out there on the job site. That's absorbent, so you want to make sure you moisten it or dampen it prior to performing your slump test. Your mold is filled in 3 equal lifts, and that's equal lifts by volume. So because this is not a cylinder, volume is not equal to your heights are not going to be equal. So your first third by volume will be approximately 2 5/8 inches above the base, and then your second lift will be a total of 6 1/8 inches above the bottom. Each lift is going to be consolidated 25 times with the tamping rod, and that tamping rod needs to go completely through each lift and 1 inch into the previous layer. And that 25 has to be exact. When Keith talks to you to prepare you for these tests, he's going to say, count out loud, right? You're going to feel kind of goofy, you're going to kind of feel dumb, but if you count your numbers out loud, you generally don't mess up. If you only rod it 24 times, the proctor will have to fail you on the ACI day when you take the test. The tamping rod, this question comes up all the time, is what's the shape of the tamping rod? And the ends of your tamping rod here are rounded or hemispherical. I guarantee you those questions are going to show up on the written portion of the test. Unlike all of the other tests where you're filling up a mold, you do not strike the sides of the mold with your hand or a mallet. So you're only using the rod to consolidate this sample. After you've put your third lift and consolidated it 25 times, you want to strike it smooth simply with the tamping rod itself. You don't have a trowel, you're just using the tamping rod, holding it horizontally and going back and forth in a rolling and sawing motion to get a nice flat smooth surface on the top. This is the step people forget, is to clean any excess concrete from around the base of the mold before you actually lift the mold away. So just use your fingers, right? Scoop it with your hands and move it off to the side. When you lift the mold up, you want to pull it straight up. You don't want to twist it or turn it, and you don't want to be super fast. You want to lift it over 5 seconds plus or minus 2 seconds. So I guarantee you that'll be a question on the test as well, is how long do you have to lift the mold in your slump test? So it's essentially no less than 3, no more than 7 seconds. As soon as you've done that, you want to invert your mold, just like they're showing in the upper picture here, and use your tamping rod as a reference line, and you want to measure your slump to the nearest 1/4 inch. And the point that you measure to is to the center of the displaced mass. So where did the original middle of the top end up? That's the point where you're measuring your slump to. And down here in the bottom, these are some of the conditions you see. If it's really wet, really high water to cement ratio, you just get a big puddle of concrete. It's kind of tough to tell where the center of the original mass is. But more often than not, you get these shear failings. And if that's the case, this is the point right there, typically where you're going to be measuring your slump. Or there are conditions that probably Keith can talk a little better where you might want to reject the slump test and perform it again. if you've had a shear failing. I'm going to have you watch some videos on these and practice the written test questions with this week's homework.